My name is Brian Croft, and I'm the senior pastor of Auburndale Baptist Church here in Louisville, Kentucky. And I also founded a ministry called Practical Shepherding, which just celebrated our 10-year anniversary. That is a ministry of resources and trying to train pastors and care for pastors, teach them about the practical aspects of ministry, the things that they don't learn at seminary, but they need to know for ministry. A third hat I wear is I'm the senior fellow for the Mathena Center for Church Revitalisation at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. So in the United States especially, there's a big movement, or has been for about 15 years, where the trendy way to movement in church is church planting. But in the last 4 to 5 years, especially in Southern Baptist churches, in Southern Baptist context where I am, they discovered that there's this epidemic of dying churches. So there's close to 1,000 churches that close every year, and that's continued into this last year. And so they started to realize if they plant all these churches, but all these churches die, that's not much of a gain. So they're continuing to plant churches, but now there's this movement that has come in the last 3 to 4 years around church revitalization, trying to save these dying churches. The problem I saw, though, is that some of the resources that were coming out on church revitalization was basically repackaged church growth from the 90s, which troubled me. That's not the approach that I feel is best. I went into Auburndale Baptist Church 15 years ago, before this was a trendy topic, to go in and try to revitalize a dying church, and by God's grace, we were able to do that, and I continue to pastor there. But how we approached that particular way of revitalization was important, and I wanted to be able to advocate for that. And it's an approach that's not about gimmicks and pragmatism and programs and trying to get quick fixes for churches, but to go in and realize the Word is what builds the church. So you go in and preach the Word, and you love the people, and you care for people's souls. You do evangelism, you disciple people, and so a biblical approach, I would say, to try to revitalize a church that really had not yet gotten a lot of traction in this growing trendy movement within the SBC. So because I had gone into a church and had done this very thing, and nothing had been written on this, I knew this is what I wanted to eventually write about. My story at the church and all that happened there. I wanted to be able to write about this methodology of church revitalization. So this book, Biblical Church Revitalisation, came out of that particular methodology. I wanted to be able to push for that philosophy. This became the philosophy of how we train students at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary around church revitalization, a lot of the work I'm doing there. But this book became kind of a template to push that kind of model of revitalization, that you focus on the Bible being what brings life to the church, and you preach it and you minister the Word and you trust the Spirit to work and you love people and you care for their souls. It's a longer work to do that kind of work. It takes longer. It's more of a grinding work, but I feel it's the most effective way. So the book was written to advocate for that particular model. When I read the Bible, I see that God breathes life into His people through His Word, by His Spirit through His Word. And so we have to try to facilitate that in a local church to the best of that's our job as a pastor who comes in to try to revitalize a church. So that's 15 years ago, I went into our church that was about 2 to 3 years from closing. And I just went in committed that I was going to preach the Word and love people and try to reach the lost around us, and trusting that the Word was enough to build the church. And that sometimes isn't a popular way to approach it, because people want quick fixes and rapid number growth and all those kinds of things, a quick recovery. But oftentimes I say that it takes 5+ years to go in and do this work. I think when you read the Bible, there's this fallacy that people think because the Word of God is powerful, that it acts quickly. And I don't believe that's the design God. You read Mark 4, the parable of the sower, that the seed is sown. It falls on the ground, but it has to find good soil, and then it has to grow and has to sprout out of the ground, and then eventually it bears fruit. And I think that's how you have to approach revitalization if you're going to believe the Word's what does that work. You have to go and preach and minister the Word and trust the Spirit's at work through His Word, and it takes years to do that. And so I'm committed to somebody going. I tell guys, you have to go a minimum and stay a minimum of 5 years and preach and love people and just stick it out. because there's inevitably baggage that comes with that hurting, dying church that you also have to help people work through. So it's a longer process, but one that I think brings more lasting life. You can go in and do trendy things, and there are things you can do to draw a crowd, but revitalization isn't about just trying to restore a church to numbers. Revitalization of a church is the Spirit of God to breathe, gospel life back into a church, to where that church becomes a lighthouse in that community to minister the gospel, to bring truth to that place, and to bring light to a dark place. I mean, that's the point of revitalizing a church. And there's a grinding work that comes with that. And if you think about it, you read the Bible, but you also look at history. Like, it always seems to be God's design that He would call a servant of God to go either be a missionary in a foreign land or come be a pastor somewhere, and have to just faithfully grind that out for years. I mean, how many stories do we hear and we celebrate that in 2 years a church was restored back to normal in these ways? No, it's 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And there's something glorious about not just the way God works in that way, but the perseverance of His saints that go in to try to do that work. A lot of the revitalization work I do, where this book came out of, is from my story at the church. And at our church, there were 3 different movements to get me fired in the first 5 years of the church. So I walked into a hostile environment in the church there. And then God turned this church at year 6, and we flourished from that day on. That's a redemptive part of this story of our church now that I had no idea. Probably wouldn't have gone if I knew what it was going to be like in those first 5 years and how difficult it was. But as I look back on it now, it was all God's plan to not just revitalize a church, but to show that He's the one that had to do it. The pastor to go in and revitalize a church, it's a unique call in some ways. But what I continually tell students I train, even pastors I work with, is this is just a call to go be a faithful pastor in this church, which means you go preach the word and you love these people and you care for their souls and try to be gospel light in that community. That's what you should do as a pastor, regardless on where you go. The reality, though, in churches that are dying is there's something that's caused them to die. You're not starting at ground zero. And so that's what makes it a great challenge. So I would say the unique challenges of church revitalization for a pastor to go in, you have to go in realizing it's going to be hard. It's going to be grinding work. You will have to realize it's going to take many years to accomplish whatever you want to accomplish, which means you have to go in with the idea of perseverance. So I tell guys you have to go stay a minimum of 5 years in a church to see any kind of results from your hard work in those 5 years. The problem is the average stay of a pastor still in the church is 2 to 3 years. So we have a problem. No wonder there's an epidemic in the church and all these churches are dying. Pastors come in for 2 to 3 years. They get discouraged because the work's really hard. They're not seeing a lot of fruit yet. They get discouraged and leave. And then the cycle continues. So I'm trying to raise up and train pastors to go into these churches and realize you have to stay longer to see the result. So perseverance is a big piece to that. But if you're going to persevere in a hard environment, the other thing I tell pastors is you have to figure out how to survive it. And that's about caring for your own soul. It's about realizing your identity is not in your ministry. Your identity is in Christ. And you have to be at peace with Christ in the work you're doing, trusting Him, whatever's happening is good for you. It's according to His will, what He wants for your ministry and for that church. And a lot of guys go in and try to make things happen. And you have to go in, and that's another wonderful thing about relying on the Word to do this work, is you go in and you're a steward to care for people and preach the Word, but trusting God's going to do what He wants with this church. It is not a problem, or it's not bad if a church closes. That may be what God's will is. It's a noble calling for a man to go in, pastor a church, shepherd those older folks to their grave to meet Jesus, and figure out how to close that church and use those resources for the kingdom. So church revitalization isn't just about trying to save all these churches. It's also about going in and just doing good kingdom work in all these different churches. So as a pastor tries to sort through his calling for church revitalization, a lot of it has to do with perseverance. A lot of it has to do with how to survive in the midst of a hard environment. But that last piece is realizing your ministry that Christ is calling you to may not look like you think it's going to look. But that doesn't mean it's not honoring to God and it glorifies Him.